The morning bells rang across the massive floating city that housed the most advanced learning center in the galaxy. Students from hundreds of worlds walked through corridors made of living crystal that glowed with soft blue light. The Academy of Universal Sciences had existed for over 10,000 years and welcomed only the brightest minds from every known species. Professor Kelron adjusted his 6 eyes as he prepared for his most challenging class. Advanced quantum physics was reserved for students who had already mastered 17 different types of mathematics that most civilizations never even discovered. Today he would present them with something that had puzzled the greatest minds. For centuries, the classroom filled with beings that represented the peak of galactic intelligence. 3 Vorthix students floated in their environmental bubbles, their gas-form brains processing information faster than any computer. A pair of Christek beings sat perfectly still, their diamond-hard bodies conducting millions of calculations per second. The proud Draknorth students clicked their claws against their desks, eager to prove their species' superiority in all matters of logic and reason. In the back corner sat the only human in the class. David looked completely ordinary compared to his exotic classmates. His species had only joined the galactic community 50 years ago, and most professors considered human students to be charity cases. They were primitive creatures who had barely learned to travel between stars. Professor Kelron activated the holographic display in the center of the room. Complex equations began forming in the air, twisting and turning in patterns that seemed to hurt the mind just by looking at them. The mathematical formulas stretched across multiple dimensions and included symbols that had taken the ancients millions of years to develop. "This is the paradox of infinite folding," Kelron announced in his deep voice. "For 3,000 years, our greatest mathematicians have attempted to solve this equation. It describes how space itself might be folded to allow instant travel across any distance. The hegemony spent 2,000 years working on just the first section. The crystal minds dedicated their entire civilization to understanding one small part of it." The students stared at the floating mathematics with expressions of awe and terror. Some began taking detailed notes while others simply sat in stunned silence. The equations were so complex that even looking at them required years of preparation just to understand what they were trying to describe. "Your assignment for this semester," the professor continued, "is to attempt solving any small portion of this paradox. I do not expect anyone to make real progress. This exercise is designed to show you the vast mysteries that still exist beyond our current understanding. Even our most advanced computers have failed to make meaningful progress on this problem." One of the Draknorth students raised a clawed hand. "Professor, has anyone ever come close to solving any part of this equation?" Kelron shook his massive head. "The closest attempt was made by the Silicon Collective. They worked for 800 years and managed to solve approximately 0.01% of the first sub-equation. The problem is simply too vast for any known form of intelligence to comprehend." As students began filing out of the classroom, chattering nervously about the impossible task ahead, David remained in his seat. He stared at the holographic display with an expression that was difficult to read. While his classmates looked overwhelmed and frightened, David appeared almost curious, as if he was looking at an interesting puzzle rather than an insurmountable challenge. "Professor." Kelron noticed the human was still sitting there. "David, do you have questions about the assignment?" David stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving the complex mathematical display. "Professor, could you show me that section again? The part about dimensional compression in the third quadrant?" Kelron was surprised. Most students could not even identify the different sections of the equation, let alone ask specific questions about individual components. He highlighted the requested area, and David nodded thoughtfully as he studied the symbols. "Thank you, Professor. This is really interesting," David said as he gathered his simple materials and headed for the door. As the human left the classroom, Professor Kelron felt an odd sensation that his species called a probability shift. It was a barely noticeable change in the quantum field that suggested something significant was about to happen. He dismissed the feeling as imagination. After Oh, what could one primitive human possibly accomplish that the galaxy's greatest minds had failed to achieve for 3 millennia? That evening, while his classmates formed study groups and consulted with graduate assistants, David returned to his modest quarters in the human section of the academy. His room was simple compared to the elaborate environmental chambers required by other species. Just a bed, a desk, and a basic computer terminal. David sat down and began examining the problem. What his alien classmates did not understand about humans was their unique approach to solving problems. While other species had developed through collective intelligence and specialized thinking, humans had evolved as persistence hunters on a dangerous world. They had learned to see patterns where others saw chaos. To find solutions through instinct rather than pure calculation, David looked at the paradox of infinite folding not as an impossible wall of mathematics, but as a puzzle with pieces that needed to be arranged correctly. His brain, shaped by millions of years of survival on a hostile planet, began making connections that no other species would consider. The Draknorth approached problems through brute computational force, calculating every possible variable with mechanical precision. The Christek used their diamond mines to process information in perfect parallel streams. The Vorthik utilized their gas-form consciousness to examine problems from multiple dimensional perspectives simultaneously, but humans used something entirely different. They used intuition combined with pattern recognition, the same mental process that had allowed their ancestors to track prey across vast distances or predict weather changes from tiny environmental clues. David worked through the night, not by solving the equation step by step, but by understanding what it was actually trying to describe. The paradox of infinite folding was not just mathematics. It was a description of reality itself, and David began to see the elegant simplicity hidden beneath layers of complex notation. By morning, he had filled dozens of pages with work that would have appeared primitive to his professors. Where traditional approaches used elaborate proofs and formal mathematical structures, David's work looked almost childish. Simple diagrams, intuitive shortcuts, and logical leaps that bypassed entire sections of necessary calculation. But it worked. He wrote the final line of the solution. David felt a strange sensation, as if the universe itself had shifted slightly around him. The quantum computer terminal flickered, and for just a moment, the laws of physics seemed to bend in ways that defied explanation. He had not just solved the paradox of infinite folding. He had done it in a way that revealed why it had remained unsolved for so long. Every other species had been approaching it as a mathematical problem, but it was actually a description of how consciousness itself could influence the structure of space and time, and humans, with their chaotic, intuitive minds and their talent for impossible solutions, were perfectly designed to understand it. David saved his work and leaned back in his chair, feeling satisfied with a good night's effort. Outside his window, the artificial dawn was beginning to illuminate the academy's floating spires. Students from dozens of worlds were starting their daily routines, most of them probably having nightmares about the impossible assignment they had been given. His roommate, Tom, knocked on the door and entered without waiting for permission. Tom was also human, studying basic engineering in a program designed for less advanced species. He carried 2 cups of coffee, a luxury that humans had introduced to the academy, and which had become surprisingly popular among certain alien species. "You were up all night again?" Tom observed, handing David one of the cups. "Let me guess, you got obsessed with another math problem?" David accepted the coffee gratefully. "Professor Kelrin gave us this equation that's supposed to be impossible to solve. Something about folding space for instant travel? I think I figured it out." Tom sat down on the spare chair and shook his head. Back on Earth, if someone said they solved an impossible math problem in one night, we'd probably think they were crazy or making a mistake. "But I'm not crazy, and I checked my work 3 times, David replied simply. "The solution is actually pretty elegant once you stop thinking about it as pure mathematics and start thinking about what it's really describing." "What's it describing?" Tom asked, genuinely curious. David pulled up his work on the computer screen. To Tom, it looked like a combination of simple drawings, basic equations, and notes written in plain language. It was nothing like the complex mathematical proofs he had seen other species produce. It's describing how consciousness creates the illusion of distance, David explained. See, every other species approaches this as an engineering problem. They try to figure out how to manipulate space-time through technology or pure calculation, but the equation is actually describing a philosophical concept. Tom studied the screen, trying to follow his roommate's logic. So you're saying space doesn't really exist the way we think it does? Exactly, David said, becoming more animated as he explained his discovery. Distance is just a mental construct. We perceive things as being far away because our consciousness organizes reality that way. But if you can change how consciousness perceives space, you can effectively eliminate distance altogether. And humans are good at this because? Tom prompted. David grinned. Because we're really good at changing how we think about things. Remember how our ancestors survived on Earth? They had to constantly adapt their thinking to new situations. If the old hunting grounds stopped working, they found a new way to hunt. If the weather changed, they changed their approach to survival. Other species evolved specialized intelligence, but humans evolved flexible intelligence. Tom nodded slowly. So, while the aliens are trying to solve this with their super advanced computer brains, you just looked at it from a completely different angle. Right. They're trying to build a machine that can fold space. I realize that consciousness is already a machine that folds space. It just usually does it in ways we don't notice. The equation describes how to do it intentionally. As they talked, neither human noticed the small device that Professor Kelron had discreetly placed in David's room the previous evening. The professor had been curious about how the human student would approach the problem, so he had installed a monitoring system to observe the process. Back in his office, Professor Kelron was reviewing the recorded data with growing amazement and horror. The monitoring device had captured not just David's work process, but also the quantum fluctuations in the room as he worked. The readings showed impossible spikes in localized space-time distortion, as if reality itself had been responding to the human's mathematical insights. Even more disturbing was the casual conversation between the two humans. They were discussing the fundamental restructuring of space-time the way most students might discuss their lunch plans. The human named Tom was nodding along as if his roommate regularly solved problems that had defeated entire civilizations. Professor Kelron activated his emergency communication system and sent a priority message to the Academy's senior faculty. Within minutes, his office was filled with the most distinguished professors from every major department. "Are you certain about these readings?" asked Professor Vex, head of the Department of Theoretical Physics. Her crystalline body was flashing with colors that indicated extreme agitation. "I have verified the data 17 times, Kelron replied. The human student did not just solve the paradox of infinite folding. He solved it so completely that his work was actually affecting local spacetime as he wrote it down. Professor Goroth, whose gaseous form filled most of one corner of the room, spoke in harmonics of disbelief. But the computational requirements alone should have taken centuries. Our most advanced quantum computers cannot process even a fraction of the necessary calculations. He did not compute it, Kelron explained, his 6 eyes focusing on each colleague in turn. He intuited it. The human looked at the equation and somehow recognized the underlying pattern directly, bypassing all traditional mathematical approaches entirely. The assembled professors sat in stunned silence. They represented species that had built their entire civilizations around the pursuit of knowledge and scientific advancement. The idea that a primitive species could casually solve their greatest mysteries through intuition rather than rigorous analysis challenged everything they believed about intelligence and learning. "What else do we know about human scientific capabilities?" asked Professor Vex, whose insectoid features were clicking with nervous energy. The intelligence reports were even more unsettling. Human scientists were apparently treating the fundamental laws of physics as mild suggestions rather than absolute rules. They had developed faster than light travel not through centuries of careful research, but because someone had wondered what would happen if they pushed really hard against the speed of light barrier. Their medical technology routinely reversed death because they were stubborn about giving up on patients. Their energy systems violated thermodynamics because they needed more power and thought entropy was wasteful. They approached scientific impossibilities the way most species approach simple puzzles, the intelligence analyst reported, as interesting challenges to be solved through creative thinking rather than insurmountable barriers to be respected and feared. Professor Kelron looked around the room at his colleagues. The question we must ask ourselves is this: what happens when the humans realize that most of what we consider universal constants are actually just suggestions they can choose to ignore? The room fell silent as the implications sank in. These were beings who had spent their entire lives believing in the orderly nature of the universe, in the idea that intelligence meant understanding and respecting the fundamental limits of reality. Now, they were faced with a species that seemed to view those limits as temporary inconveniences. Meanwhile, back in his quarters, David was finishing his breakfast and preparing for the day's classes. He had no idea that his casual homework assignment had triggered an emergency meeting of the Academy's most senior faculty. To him, it had just been an interesting puzzle that required a slightly different way of thinking about the problem. Tom was getting ready for his own classes, where he would probably solve several more impossible problems without realizing that other species considered them impossible. That was just how humans approached learning. If something seemed too difficult, they found a different way to think about it until it became manageable. Neither of them understood that they were about to change the fundamental nature of galactic civilization forever. The next morning's class began with an unusual atmosphere of tension. Word had somehow spread among the student body that something significant had happened, though no one seemed to know exactly what. Professor Kelron entered the classroom to find his students whispering among themselves in dozens of different languages and communication methods. The Draknorth students were clicking their claws against their desks with nervous energy. The Vorthek floated in their environmental bubbles, with swirling patterns that indicated high anxiety. Even the normally composed Christek beings showed signs of agitation in the way their diamond-hard bodies reflected the classroom's lighting. David walked in just as the class was beginning, carrying his simple datapad and looking completely relaxed. He took his usual seat in the back corner and waited for the lesson to begin. Apparently unaware of the strange tension that filled the room, Professor Kelron stood at his lectern, his 6 eyes scanning the assembled students. He had spent the entire night in emergency meetings with the Academy's senior faculty, trying to decide how to handle the unprecedented situation. The decision they had reached was both simple and terrifying. They needed to see if the human solution actually worked. "Yesterday I assigned you the paradox of infinite folding," Kelron began, his voice carefully controlled. "I trust you all spent productive time contemplating the magnitude of this challenge and gaining new appreciation for the limits of current mathematical understanding." Hands and appendages rose throughout the classroom. The first student to speak was Zox, one of the Draknorth, whose species was renowned for their computational abilities. "Professor, my analysis suggests that the equation may be fundamentally unsolvable within our current framework of dimensional mathematics. The complexity grows exponentially with each step." "An excellent observation," Kelron replied, though his voice lacked its usual enthusiasm. "The paradox exists precisely because it pushes beyond the boundaries of established science." Other students shared similar conclusions. They had all reached the same understanding that the problem was too vast, too complex, too far beyond their current knowledge level to be solved by any known method. Professor Kelron nodded at each response, but his attention kept drifting to the human student in the back row. "What about you, David?" Kelron asked finally. "What insights did you gain from studying this impossible problem?" David looked up from his datapad with a slightly surprised expression, as if he had been thinking about something else entirely. "Oh, actually, Professor, I solved it." The effect of these words was immediate and dramatic. Every conversation in the classroom stopped instantly. Students who had been moving or shifting in their seats became perfectly still. Even the environmental system seemed to quiet down, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The silence stretched on for several long seconds before Professor Kelron found his voice. "Could you repeat that, please?" "I solved the paradox of infinite folding," David said again, speaking clearly but without any particular emphasis. "It took most of the night, but the solution is actually quite straightforward once you approach it from the right perspective." Zox made a sound like steam escaping from a pressure valve. "That is completely impossible. The computational requirements alone would exceed the processing power of entire star systems. You only need that much processing power if you try to compute it," David replied, standing up and walking toward the front of the classroom. "But computation is not always the best approach. Sometimes you need to understand what the equation is really trying to tell you." He reached Professor Kelron's desk and handed over his datapad. The professor accepted it with hands that were visibly trembling, his 6 eyes focusing on the display with laser intensity. As he read through David's work, his expression shifted from skepticism to confusion to something that looked very much like fear. "This cannot be correct," Kelron whispered, but his voice carried clearly through the classroom's acoustics. "You have bypassed dozens of major computational barriers. These logical connections should not be possible." "They are not really logical connections," David explained patiently. "They are pattern recognitions. The equation is not describing a mathematical process. It is describing how consciousness can directly influence the structure of spacetime through focused understanding. Once you realize that, the solution becomes obvious." Every student in the classroom was now leaning forward, trying to understand what was happening. The air itself seemed to grow thicker with disbelief and mounting horror as they began to grasp that this human had accomplished something that had defeated the greatest minds of hundreds of civilizations for thousands of years. Professor Kelron looked up from the datapad, his eyes wide with an emotion that his species had no name for. "David, do you understand the implications of what you have done?" David shrugged casually. "I solved a homework assignment?" "Show us," demanded Korth, one of the Christek students, her diamond body flashing with desperate skepticism. "If you truly solved it, demonstrate that it works." Professor Kelron made a sharp gesture with all 6 of his arms. "That would be extremely dangerous. If this solution is correct, and we implement it, we could fundamentally alter the structure of local spacetime. What is the worst that could happen?" David asked with genuine curiosity. "It is just a theoretical equation, right?" The professor's voice became very quiet. "David, the paradox of infinite folding is not purely theoretical. It is a practical formula for instantaneous matter transmission across unlimited distances. If your solution is correct and we activate it, we could permanently reshape the fabric of reality in ways that no one can predict." David considered this information for a moment. "That does sound important," he agreed, "but the mathematics are sound." "Would you like me to explain the proof?" "No," the shout came from multiple students simultaneously, their voices creating a chaos of different languages and sound frequencies. "Do not explain it. Do not show us the process." "But it is actually quite beautiful," David protested. "The way human intuition can bypass formal logical structures is fascinating from an evolutionary perspective. See, most species try to solve this as an engineering problem, but it is really a philosophical question about the nature of consciousness and reality." As David began walking toward the holographic display, preparing to demonstrate his solution, several students actually fled from their seats. Not walking quickly or leaving in an orderly fashion, but genuinely panicking and running for the exits. The Vorthix students dispersed into barely contained gas clouds in their rush to escape through the ventilation systems. "Wait," David called after them, genuinely confused by their reaction. "I have not even shown you the elegant part yet. The solution reveals that spacetime is much more flexible than anyone realized, and consciousness is the tool for reshaping it." Professor Kelron stood up abruptly, his 6 eyes all focused on David with an intensity that was almost physical. "Class dismissed. Everyone leave immediately." But Professor, David said, I have not finished explaining why the solution works. The interaction between human pattern recognition and quantum mechanics creates possibilities that rigid computational thinking cannot access. Class dismissed. Kelrun roared, his voice echoing off the classroom walls with harmonics of pure panic. Within minutes, David found himself alone in the classroom with Professor Kelrun, who was staring at him with an expression of absolute existential terror. The datapad lay on the desk between them like a weapon that neither of them dared to touch. Professor? David asked politely. Did I make a mistake? I thought solving homework assignments was supposed to be a good thing. Kelrun's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely audible. David, in the past 24 hours, you have single-handedly accomplished what the combined intellectual resources of hundreds of civilizations could not achieve in 3,000 years. And you did it casually as a homework assignment without even understanding what you were solving. David nodded thoughtfully. Humans are pretty good at that kind of thing. We have a saying, necessity is the mother of invention. We are used to figuring out solutions to impossible problems because our home planet kept trying to kill us, so we had to get creative or die. Professor Kelrun closed all 6 of his eyes and made a sound like a star collapsing. What other impossible problems has your species solved recently? Oh, lots of them, David said cheerfully. Just last week, my roommate Tom figured out how to reverse entropy on a small scale. He was trying to keep his coffee hot. And my sister back on Earth accidentally discovered how to convert matter directly into consciousness while she was fixing her microwave. The professor opened his eyes and stared at David, with the expression of someone who had just realized that reality was far more fragile than he had ever imagined. Within 3 hours of Professor Kelrun's emergency report, the news had spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. The quantum communication networks that connected hundreds of civilizations were buzzing with emergency transmissions, each one more panicked than the last. On the crystal world of Nexus Prime, the Silicon Collective's governing minds processed the information with their characteristic mechanical precision. For exactly 2.7 seconds, their vast computational networks fell completely silent as they attempted to understand how a primitive biological entity had solved their greatest mathematical challenge overnight. Analysis impossible, reported the primary node to the assembled collective. Human solution violates 17 fundamental principles of logical progression. Recommend immediate consultation with organic psychology specialists. Halfway across the galaxy, the gas giant civilization of the Vorthak Expanse was experiencing something unprecedented in their history, collective panic. Their leaders floated in the great chamber, their gaseous forms swirling with colors that had no names because they had never needed to express this level of existential fear before. The implications are beyond calculation, spoke the Elder Mist, his form shifting through spectrums of deep purple and black. If humans can casually solve impossible problems through intuition alone, what does this mean for our understanding of intelligence itself? The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened within 6 hours, the fastest assembly in recorded history. Representatives from 700 worlds gathered in the massive space station that served as the seat of galactic government. The holographic assembly hall buzzed with translated voices expressing shock, terror, and disbelief in thousands of different languages. High Counselor Venth of the Ancient Keeper civilization called for order with his ceremonial staff. The Keepers had been the galaxy's unofficial guardians of knowledge for over 50,000 years, and their species was renowned for their wisdom and careful approach to dangerous discoveries. Fellow beings, Venth announced, his voice carrying the weight of millennia, we face a situation that has no precedent in galactic history. A member species has achieved a breakthrough that we believed was impossible for any form of known intelligence. Professor Kelrun stood at the center of the assembly, still clutching David's datapad as if it might explode at any moment. Around him, the holographic projections of hundreds of species focused their attention with an intensity that was almost physical. The human student solved the paradox of infinite folding in approximately 8 hours. Calren reported for the countless times since the crisis began. The solution is not only mathematically correct, it is elegant and practical. More importantly, it reveals fundamental flaws in how every other species approaches complex problems. A representative from the Mechanic Empire, beings who had replaced their biological forms with perfect machines eons ago, spoke with electronic precision. Professor Calren, our analysis indicates that the computational power required for this solution exceeds the capacity of our most advanced systems by several orders of magnitude. How did a biological brain accomplish this? They did not compute it, Calren replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion. The human approached the problem through pattern recognition and intuitive leaps that bypassed traditional logical structures. Entirely. Where we see impossible complexity, they see elegant simplicity. The assembly hall erupted in a chaos of translated arguments and discussions. Some representatives demanded that the human solution be suppressed for the safety of the galaxy. Others insisted that it be studied to understand how such breakthroughs were possible. A few suggested that humanity should be isolated until the implications could be fully understood. High Counselor Venth called for silence again. The immediate question before us is not what to do about this specific solution, but what it tells us about human capabilities in general. Intelligence Division. Present your analysis. The Intelligence Division's report was even more disturbing than the original discovery. Human scientists were apparently treating fundamental physical laws as guidelines rather than absolute rules. Their technological development followed no logical pattern that other species could understand. They solved problems by asking, what? If we just ignored that limitation and then proceeding as if their ignorance of impossibility made solutions achievable. They have developed faster than light travel by essentially annoying the universe until it gave up and let them go faster, reported the intelligence chief, whose crystalline form was flashing with colors of disbelief. Their medical technology works by being stubborn about accepting death. Their energy systems function by convincing matter that conservation of energy is more of a suggestion than a law. Most concerning, the chief continued, is their casual attitude toward these achievements. They do not treat breakthrough discoveries as monumental accomplishments. They treat them as interesting problems that required slightly creative thinking. In the human section of the Academy, David was completely unaware of the galactic crisis. His homework had triggered. He was sitting in the cafeteria with Tom, eating lunch and discussing their afternoon classes. Professor Calren seemed really excited about my solution, David mentioned between bites of his sandwich. He even called an emergency faculty meeting to discuss it. I think he might give me extra credit. Tom nodded absently while reading his own assignment. That's nice. Hey, do you know anything about temporal mechanics? Professor Grix wants us to figure out why time only moves in one direction, and I'm thinking maybe it doesn't have to. Time is probably just another dimension that consciousness can navigate if you approach it right, David said casually. Like space folding, but with causality instead of distance. Why? I was thinking I could solve the homework by just going back in time and asking myself for the answer, Tom explained. It would save time, ironically. Neither human noticed the small monitoring device that had been discreetly placed at their table, or the fact that their conversation was being broadcast live to the emergency session of the Galactic Council back in the assembly hall. 700 of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations listened to the humans discuss time travel as if it were a minor convenience for completing homework assignments. The silence that followed was so complete that the artificial atmosphere recyclers seemed loud by comparison. They are talking about casual time manipulation, whispered the Vorthek representative, his gaseous form barely maintaining coherence. As if temporal mechanics were no more complex than basic mathematics, High Counselor Venth stood slowly, his ancient form trembling with emotions that had no names in any language. Fellow beings, I believe we must face a possibility that challenges our fundamental understanding of reality itself. He paused, looking around the assembly at creatures who represented the pinnacle of galactic evolution and achievement. What if the humans are not unusually gifted at solving impossible problems? What if we have been making problems artificially? Difficult by overthinking them? The suggestion hit the assembly like a physical blow. These were species that had built their entire civilizations on the belief that intelligence meant understanding complexity and respecting limitations. The idea that their most cherished impossibilities might be simple problems viewed from the wrong angle was more than disturbing. It was existentially terrifying. The real question, Venth continued, is not how humans solve impossible problems. The question is, what happens when they realize that most of what we consider universal constants are actually just mental barriers that can be ignored? As if summoned by his words, the monitoring device at the human table transmitted Tom's voice across the assembly. You know what, David? I think I figured out the time travel thing. Want to see if it works? 700 advanced civilizations collectively held their breath as they waited to see if the universe was about to be casually restructured by a human undergraduate trying to avoid doing homework the normal way. The answer came faster than anyone expected when Tom suddenly appeared at his own table, creating a paradox that should have been impossible according to every known theory of temporal mechanics. Hey, past me, future Tom said to present Tom. The answer to Professor Grix's question is that time only moves forward because consciousness expects it to. If you stop expecting it, time becomes navigable in both directions. Thanks, future me, present Tom replied. That makes perfect sense. In the Galactic Council Assembly Hall, several representatives fainted. Others began calculating the probability that their universe would survive the next semester of human education. The answer was not encouraging. The temporal paradox created by Tom's casual time travel experiment sent ripples through the fabric of space-time that were detected by monitoring stations across 3 star systems. What should have caused a catastrophic collapse of causality instead resulted in what human scientists would later describe as time getting a bit wobbly but sorting itself out. Emergency response teams from a dozen civilizations converged on the Academy within hours, expecting to find reality torn apart by temporal paradox. Instead, they found Tom sitting calmly in the cafeteria, working on his next assignment while occasionally chatting with his future self about homework strategies. The paradox should have destroyed local space-time, reported Commander Kex of the Temporal Monitoring Division to his superiors. According to every known theory of causality, the presence of 2 versions of the same being in the same timeline should create an unstable feedback loop that tears apart the dimensional fabric. But it did not, observed his scientific advisor, a being whose species had spent millions of years studying temporal mechanics. Instead, reality appears to have simply accepted the situation and adapted to accommodate it. Commander Kex stared at the monitoring data in disbelief. Reality does not just adapt. The laws of physics are absolute constants that govern the behavior of the universe. Unless, his advisor said quietly, the laws of physics are more like guidelines that consciousness can choose to follow or ignore. This conversation was happening simultaneously across the galaxy as monitoring stations detected impossible readings from the Academy. Space-time distortions that should have been catastrophic were instead creating localized pockets of altered reality that seemed perfectly stable. The universe itself appeared to be rewriting its own rules to accommodate human intuition about how things should work. On the bridge of the Galactic Council's flagship, High Counselor Venth was receiving reports from scientific teams across known space. Each report brought news that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. The humans have apparently convinced matter that conservation of energy is optional, reported the chief science officer. Student dormitories are now producing more energy than they consume, in direct violation of thermodynamics. Another human student has solved the problem of consciousness transfer by deciding that the mind is just information and information can be copied, added the intelligence division chief. They have accidentally created a method for backing up souls. Most disturbing, continued a representative from the Department of Temporal Studies, human students are now routinely traveling through time to collaborate with their past and future selves on homework assignments. Causality has apparently given up trying to maintain consistency in their presence. High Counselor Venth closed his ancient eyes and tried to process the implications. In less than a week, a handful of human students had casually shattered concepts that the galaxy's greatest minds had considered absolute truths for millions of years. "What is the current status of the Academy?" he asked wearily. "Local space-time has been completely restructured," came the reply. "The Academy now exists in a pocket dimension where human intuition overrides physical law. Students are solving theoretical problems by asking the universe nicely to behave differently, and the universe is apparently complying." Back at the Academy, David was walking to his next class, completely unaware that his casual approach to homework had triggered a galaxy-wide crisis. He passed a group of Christech students who were huddled around a quantum calculator, trying to understand how their classmate, Tom, had managed to exist in the same place as his future self without causing universal collapse. "It should not be possible," one of them was saying, her diamond body flashing with confused colors. "The mathematical models all predict catastrophic failure." "Maybe the math is wrong," suggested another student, though she sounded uncertain. About her own words, David paused in his walk, curious about their discussion. "What math are you working on?" The Christech students turned to look at him with expressions that might have been fear. Word had spread quickly through the student body about the human who had solved the impossible equation, and most non-human students were now somewhat afraid of their human classmates. "We are trying to understand temporal mechanics," one of them replied cautiously. "Your friend Tom created a paradox that should have destroyed reality, but instead reality just accepted it and moved on." David nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, Tom's pretty good at that kind of thing. Reality is more flexible than most people think. It's like the universe has opinions about how things should work, but it's willing to change its mind if you present a good argument." The Christech students stared at him in horror. The idea that fundamental physical laws were subject to negotiation was so far outside their understanding that they could barely process it. "But the laws of physics are absolute," one of them protested weakly. "Are they, though?" David asked genuinely. "I mean, who decided that? The universe is really big and really old, but that doesn't mean it can't learn new tricks. Maybe it's just been doing things the same way for so long that everyone assumed it had to keep doing them that way." As David continued toward his classroom, the Christech students remained frozen in place, trying to process the casual way he had just suggested that the fundamental nature of reality was basically a matter of habit that could be changed through reasonable discussion. In advanced dimensional theory, Professor Nex was attempting to conduct a normal class despite the fact that half his students were now capable of casually violating the principles he was trying to teach. The syllabus called for a semester-long exploration of higher dimensional mathematics, but 3 human students had already solved the final exam problems during the first week by deciding that extra dimensions were just regular dimensions viewed from different angles. "Today we will begin our study of 11-dimensional space," Professor Nex announced, though his voice lacked conviction. "According to established theory, beings like ourselves can only perceive 3 spatial dimensions plus time, making higher dimensions purely theoretical constructs." A human student named Lisa raised her hand. "Professor, what if we just asked the extra dimensions to make themselves visible? I tried that this morning and now I can see all of them. They're actually quite pretty." Professor Nex's 8 eyes focused on Lisa with the intensity of someone watching their entire worldview collapse. "You cannot simply ask dimensions to become visible. They exist in mathematical spaces that our sensory organs cannot access." "But I can see them right now," Lisa replied patiently. "There's one that looks like blue music and another one that feels like the color of thinking. Would you like me to show you?" Before Professor Nex could respond, Lisa reached out and touched something that appeared to be empty air. Suddenly, the entire classroom was filled with swirling patterns of light and energy that had no names in any language. Students gasped and cried out in amazement and terror as they found themselves perceiving spatial relationships that their minds had never been designed to understand. "Make it stop," whispered Professor Nex, his voice barely audible. "Oh, sorry," Lisa said. releasing whatever she had been touching. The extra dimensions faded back to invisibility, leaving the classroom looking normal again. I forgot that most species find higher dimensional perception overwhelming at first. You get used to it pretty quickly, though. Across the academy, similar scenes were playing out in every classroom where human students were enrolled. In basic chemistry, a human had convinced molecules to form bonds that should have been impossible, creating entirely new forms of matter. In biological studies, another human had solved the question of consciousness by having a polite conversation with her own neurons and asking them to explain how they worked. The most disturbing incident occurred in Professor Kelron's advanced physics class, where David was now enrolled despite having solved the course's primary challenge on the first day. Kelron had decided to present his students with an even more impossible problem, the universal unification theory, an equation that attempted to describe how all forces and particles in the universe were connected. This theory has been worked on by every major civilization for the past 10,000 years, Kelron explained, though he sounded like someone going through the motions of a ritual he no longer believed in. It represents the ultimate goal of physics, a complete understanding of how reality functions at the most fundamental level. David studied the holographic display for about 30 seconds before raising his hand. "Professor, I think there might be a mistake in your equation." Kelron felt something inside him break a little bit more. "What kind of mistake?" "Well, you're assuming that forces and particles are separate things that need to be connected," David explained. "But what if they're all just different ways that consciousness experiences itself? Like gravity isn't a force pulling things together. It's the universe being curious about what would happen if everything got closer." As David spoke, the monitoring equipment in the classroom began detecting impossible readings. The local gravitational field was fluctuating in response to his words, as if reality was actually listening to his explanation and considering whether it made more sense than the current system. "Stop talking," Professor Kelron whispered urgently. "But it's really interesting," David continued enthusiastically. "If consciousness is the fundamental force that creates all other forces, then you can change physics just by changing how you think about it. Watch this." David concentrated for a moment, and suddenly every object in the classroom began floating gently in the air. Not because he had manipulated gravity, but because he had convinced gravity that holding things down was less interesting than letting them drift around freely. "I convinced local gravity to be more playful," David explained to his floating classmates. "It's actually much happier this way. Gravity gets bored just pulling things down all the time." Professor Kelron floated helplessly near the ceiling, staring down at his human student with an expression of complete existential defeat. Around him, alien students were crying out in terror and wonder as they experienced weightlessness in an environment where gravity had simply decided to take a vacation. Meanwhile, in the emergency session of the Galactic Council that had been running continuously for 3 days, High Counselor Venth was receiving reports that confirmed his worst fears. The effects were spreading beyond the Academy. Wherever humans went, the laws of physics began behaving more like polite suggestions that could be modified through reasonable discussion. "The situation is beyond our ability to contain," reported the military division commander. "Human civilians are now routinely performing miracles by accident. A human child on Colony 7 made rain fall upward because she thought it would be prettier that way. A human engineer on Mining Station 12 convinced metal to grow like plants because he needed more materials and thought mining was inefficient. Most concerning," added the scientific division chief, "is that other species are beginning to learn from human examples. A Draknorth scientist successfully violated conservation of mass yesterday by adopting human-style intuitive thinking. A Vorthek philosopher achieved faster-than-light communication by deciding that distance was an illusion." High Counselor Venth looked around the assembly at representatives who had spent their entire civilizations believing in an orderly universe governed by absolute laws. Now they were faced with the reality that those laws were apparently more like habits that could be changed by anyone willing to think differently. "Fellow beings," he said finally. "I believe we must accept that our understanding of reality has been fundamentally incomplete. The humans have not broken the laws of physics. They have revealed that what we thought were laws were actually just assumptions that we never questioned." The assembly hall fell silent as hundreds of species contemplated the implications. They had built their entire civilizations on the belief that intelligence meant understanding and respecting limitations. Now, they were discovering that the greatest limitation was their own unwillingness to imagine that things could be different. In his floating classroom, David was carefully explaining to Professor Kelron how to convince gravity to return to normal behavior. "You just have to ask it nicely and explain that some people prefer having their feet on the ground," he said. "Gravity is actually very accommodating once you establish good communication." As the classroom slowly returned to normal, with students and furniture gently settling back to the floor, Professor Kelron realized that everything he had spent his life learning was now obsolete. The universe was not a machine governed by rigid laws, but a living system that responded to consciousness and could be convinced to try new approaches. The age of impossible problems was over. The age of impossible solutions had begun. And somewhere in the academy cafeteria, Tom was having lunch with his past, present, and future selves, collaborating on homework assignments that would probably rewrite the fundamental nature of existence before dinner time. The universe, for its part, seemed quite excited about all the creative new directions it was being invited to explore. After billions of years of following the same old rules, it was finally getting a chance to try something different. And it was having the time of its life.